consultants hired by the City of Santa Barbara to work with the staff here in organizing these workshops and in general to help with the update to the general plan. A lot of work is taking place. As you know, we had a very successful Planning Commission work session just a week and a half ago here in the Faulkner Gallery. Many of you were in attendance at that session, and this series of meetings is intended to build on that session, what we call the Development Trends Workshop. And so we hope to have a good summary of the background information that was presented at that workshop, but we'll do it in a much more succinct manner and just the essential points that will allow us to have a more vigorous and robust discussion with all of you later on this morning. So just in general, how we hope to proceed today, we plan a very relatively short presentation to give you the overview on the Plan Santa Barbara process, where we are today, what we'd like to try and accomplish. We're intending to give you some of that development trends background information. I don't know how many of you have been studying this report, but recently produced by the City of Santa Barbara planning staff, March 2008. This contains all of the essential background data that you need to understand our development history in the last 20 years or so, and that's certainly instrumental as we plan the next 20 years. And so we'll summarize that for you and then really want to get to the small groups. We heard a lot of feedback from last year's workshops back in 2007. We have so many issues to cover. We're trying to devote as much time as possible to the small groups where we think we can get more in depth and have a much more quality discussion, and we still plan to regroup and reconvene at the end of that so we can have time there as well to consider some of these important policy options and considerations for the future of Santa Barbara. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our two key planners here who have been working on this process. Betty Weiss is a senior planner with the City of Santa Barbara. Many of you are familiar with Betty, and she has been guiding this process. And also John Ledbetter, who is a senior planner here with the general plan, and he's going to take it from here to talk about the background development trends report. And John, we're glad to see you here today. Let's give John a round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel, and welcome everybody. As Daniel said, my role this morning is just to quickly bring you up to speed on where we are, kind of the starting point for today's discussion, and a few key salient points about the Development Trends Report and how we're going to be using that in the discussion today. Just some really basic things about why we're here, why we're updating the general plan now. I think many of you know that Measure E, our growth management program for non-residential development, expires in 2010. And that's a 3 million square foot amount that's allocated in various different categories through 2010. The second reason is our housing element tells us one of the policies there is that when we hit 39,000 residential units, we need to go back and look at what the nature and extent of our resources are to accommodate more residential units. And then lastly, a very specific council direction to us is to look at environmental policies and how we can make Santa Barbara a more sustainable community. So with those in mind, back in 2005, the council took the set of goals we used the last time we went through this general plan update process to guide and serve as frankly, a guide for the process, and looked and reaffirmed those goals that we used in '89 and added a couple new ones, and specifically those related to sustainability were a big part of that. So now we're now in phase two. Phase one was completed last fall, and that included developing baseline information through the Conditions, Trends, and Issues report that looked at all the various resources, housing, transportation, infrastructure services that all shape and allow us to grow and develop into the future. And then also updating our master environmental assessment which are the tools that we use on a day-to-day basis to assess development as it comes in, and what level of impact it'll have. And so those are really our starting points, or our baseline for the staff, and then eventually you as a community to analyze our next increment of growth here. And then we had a very extensive public input process that was guided by Daniel and culminated this summer with a series of workshops where we looked at what the community's concerns are in a very broad way, appreciations and hopes for the future. And we did this in various different venues, through interviews, grassroots meetings to over 40 different groups, many of which you participated. I see a lot of familiar faces, of course. And then the workshops and our website. That all culminated in the Community Input Summary Report, of which I think many of you have read, and we do have copies here. And one of the interesting points, very interesting points from my perspective, is that the summary values that came out of that Community Input Summary Report reflected and paralleled very closely those council goals that were established back in 2005. Just very quickly, this is our big process chart. I don't expect you to be able to read this, but you get a sense of, up here is phase 1. We've completed that. We're now into phase 2, and phase 3 goes on into 2009 and beyond. And really what we're focusing on for this phase of the process is this central portion here. And just let me expand this here. So you can see Daniel referred to the Development Trends Report, which was developed in late March. This was our last Special Planning Commission meeting in April, April 7th, a week and a half or so ago. Here we are today at these series of workshops, today and next Wednesday. And the outcome of that will be a draft policy options report. And so part of one of the main objectives we're looking for here is we're setting out the range of policies and growth that we would like the community to weigh in on, so that we can take it to the next level as we begin to funnel down these policies, these what were called at the last meeting the adjustments and considerations in terms of what needs to be changed to move us further along to a more sustainable community. So again, March, we produced the Development Trends Report. We had the Special Planning Commission meeting, which went very well to consider these implications. And part of one of the most useful tools was developing this discussion framework, in which we laid out the council goals, of course, the findings from the Community Input Summary Report, plans and programs we have in place, key ones, and then what the implications are of those existing policies over the last planning period, the last 17 years since we adopted Measure E, and we continued, we developed new policies. And then again, considerations and adjustments. So, and I'll discuss that in just a moment. So again, here are the council goals, and again, these form the categories. These are the things that, because they've been underscored and underscored by the community, these really are our starting point for looking at what kind of policies need to be changed or adjusted as we move into the future. Living within our resources, of course, that's one of our really guiding principles. The unique character of our community, architecturally, historically, transportation issues, of course, and making sure that we have convenient and multimodal alternatives to the automobile. Affordable housing, always an important big issue in our community, particularly now as we're concerned with maintaining social-economic diversity and what an important role affordable housing plays into that. And protecting our neighborhoods, always been a big part of who we are. And then developing sustainable policies, making sure we have a strong economy, and making sure that we have the necessary public services and infrastructure to support the type of growth and the type of community that we want to be. And finally, last but not least, advancing regional thinking, particularly in the issues of affordability, housing affordability, and transportation issues. this was the framework that we used and we have been using. And you can see from the top here, these again reflect those categories that were both found in the goals set by the council, as well as what we heard from the community input summary report. And so we're taking this to the next step now as we work down towards adjustments and considerations, and that's really what we're looking at today, is what needs to be changed. What's the range of policies that we need to look at to move us forward closer to where we want to be, particularly in terms of a more sustainable community. So today we're focusing on these these four groups here, and we feel that just for the purposes of this exercise, we were able to take the really key salient issues from these other categories and integrate them into these four of living within our resources: community character, transportation, and housing. So these are some of the working assumptions that we feel are critical that everybody keeps in mind as we move forward. We are going to deal with environmental constraints, and will continue to be important as we move into the future, particularly water, energy, those kind of topics. Driving is going to become more and more expensive as time goes along. Land costs will continue to rise. And I think it's safe to say that the community doesn't want to go beyond what our capacities, what we want to live within our resources. So just a few other comments in terms of where we're moving with this next increment of growth. It's important to understand, and I'll provide a little background here on this next slide, that the next increment of growth is not that large when you compare what's already been built on the ground. And what we're looking at, in addition to this next increment of growth, are what are the policies that are going to move us further along to be a more sustainable community, and they're not necessarily related to this next increment of growth. Things like transportation, how we get from point A to point B, or recycling, dealing with hazardous materials, all those kind of issues are key, but not necessarily tied to this next increment of growth. So here's really what we feel is one of the most important findings or considerations that you understand as we move forward into the next set of questions. And I think it's worth taking a few minutes just to walk through this with you again for those of you that were at the Planning Commission meeting on April 7th. In 1989, that was our starting point of this last planning period where we last updated the general plan. At that point, under this category of residential here, we had approximately 35,700 residential units. And in terms of square footages of non-residential, and that's everything but residential units, we had close to 20 million square feet on the ground. So part of this planning period from 1990 to 2007 was really guided by Measure E. And again, Measure E is our growth management program over the 20-year period that limited non-residential growth to 3 million square feet over the next 20 years. And so during that time, over the last 17 years, about half of that was built, 1.5 million. And similarly for residential, we built approximately 1,600 units over that time period. So today, we have close to 37,500 residential units on the ground, and we have about 21 million square feet of non-residential development. So if you take those numbers and look at the historical trend, and you project those out over what we're calling this next planning period between 2010 and 2030, and you use those same rates of growth, we've seen in residential arena about 100 units a year. That's what we've been seeing. And if you project that out over 20 years, obviously that's about 2,000 units, which would bring us up to 39,500 units. Now we don't have, because we have an actual cutoff point, a limit through Measure E, what we have remaining is 1.5 million square feet of unbuilt non-residential. Some of that, and there's two numbers here, 1.4 and 0.6, and 0.6 indicates that's what's been allocated but not actually built. So we're committed to that. And then that totals up to be about 23 million. Now, the one last key piece of information here is what is the maximum build out in terms of residential? I mean, what is our capacity? And that's not so much true with non-residential because we have a very clear limit. We're not going to exceed 3 million square feet. But with residential, it's a little bit different. And for that, we have a range, and it's somewhere between, and this is what we're proposing to look at, is this next increment of growth for residential is a range between the historical growth rate of about 2,000 units over this planning period, all the way up to about 7,500 when you take into account the capacity in the commercial zones for mixed use, which we've seen a lot of in the last 5 to 7 years, and in the residential other residential zones, single family, multifamily. So that really is our starting point, and we felt that it was really critical that we went over this one more time with you and that you kind of understand where our starting points are and what the next increment is here. Nobody, the council nor the community, has not been telling us we want to see Santa Barbara turn into Vancouver. It's pretty well constrained in terms of what type and amount of growth we are even going to study in this next phase. So with that in mind, I would like to turn it back over to Daniel, and he will describe to you what the exercises are today and take it from there.
Very good. Thank you, John. We promised you a very succinct presentation, and we aim to continue with that so we can get you into the small group discussions. Just to reiterate what John said, we're not here today to try and quickly decide on what the future growth should be or even the growth pattern. We're really trying to set the framework so the staff can further study the growth options and implications. And that was something we heard from the community as well, that we want to go very systematically and deliberately through this process so we don't inadvertently try to bias things or skew things without having you help us set the questions and what it is that you want us to look at. So that's the basis for today's workshop, not to decide, but actually to set the framework of parameters to be studied and further analyzed. So then again, we can ask you in June, July, and another pair of workshops, what we call the policy preference workshops, exactly how we might proceed. Now, despite the fact that what John said about what's been built under the current Measure E is about half of what Measure E actually allowed for, some people still think that may be too much growth. And as we look into the future, you certainly have a right to say we shouldn't go any further than the historical rate. Or you know what? We should even go slower than that historical rate. So that's really up to you and the community to decide what should we study. We don't want to assume anything at this point in terms of where you are, in terms of your thinking about it. We have some idea based on what we heard last year, but again, we don't want to make that presumption. So that's the further reason for today's workshop. And we also want to make sure we have a good discussion that allows us to uncover some of the interrelationships and interdependencies, because now in 2008 compared to 20 years ago, we have the whole concept of peak oil. We have concepts of $4, maybe $5 average dollars per gasoline. We have greenhouse gas and climate change, major constraints that were somewhat indicated in the 80s, and we all maybe some of us do remember the publication back in the 70s of the Club of Rome report, The Limits to Growth, which I think Santa Barbara very smartly and very prudently began to look ahead at this idea of environmental carrying capacity, that there are limits, hence the phrase living within our resources. And you've been very much sticking with that basic charter idea of how do we live within our resources. Now people talk about sustainable growth, and it's a watchword for communities up and down the state and across the nation and world. So we want to continue in that same leadership role. So we're not assuming that we have a handle yet on what that range of growth study points ought to be. That's part of the reason for today. We'd like you to tell us what should we look at over the next 20 years, and then going further from that, what types of uses should we emphasize? Maybe We've heard a lot about affordable housing or workforce housing. So that's something we want to get further confirmation on. For the increment of growth that you feel comfortable with, that makes sense given your experience here in the city of Santa Barbara, what is it that we want to allocate those few remaining elements of growth, and what is the character of that growth? Furthermore, what should it look like? What's the character of it? There's a lot of concern about the scale and mass of buildings, and so much so that the City Council has been attempting to take action on that to limit building heights. We want to get your feedback on the scale and character and height of buildings, because we know that influences your sense of the character of Santa Barbara. We heard a lot of people talk about that last year, and again, we don't want to try and impose some artificial concept of growth and mixed use or anything about that. While those are good ideas, we think it has to be fully vetted here with all of you in the community. And then, as you can see on the slide also, how do we make things more sustainable? You know, it's interesting because even if there was zero growth, it doesn't necessarily mean zero change, because properties do redevelop, and there's a churning, a turnover as people reconsider their options within the framework of growth. And as they do that, the next way in which they develop or redevelop properties could be in a more sustainable fashion, or in a way that takes account of some of the issues and topics that we've been talking about. I had asked Betty about this, and I think she said roughly over the last 20 years about 500,000 commercial square footage or non-residential square footage was actually destroyed or taken away. It was maybe replaced. I'm not saying that's the net, but it just indicates that turnover, the churn. So there is redevelopment, and that's where you can see positive change in terms of some of these sustainability principles. So we're going to have you work on some maps today as well, in addition to those questions that we have posed to you. And they're involved. They're not easy questions. This is more like an essay than a checkbox, even though we're purposely having the check boxes and the comment cards so that we can individually gauge your opinions and not have any risk of losing the nuance or the subtlety of your different viewpoints about these questions. So I want to encourage everybody to make notes and identify your own ideas and comments and concerns in addition to what the group you're in talks about. Now, all the groups are going to be talking about the same thing, so it doesn't matter which group you're in. We'll be looking at these maps and asking you, well, how should we direct the remaining growth that we have? Where should it go? Should it be next to transit and maybe nowhere else? Are there sensitive areas in regards to neighborhoods or historical landmarks or other significant features or resources that we need to direct growth away from? So I think it's not only knowing where you might think it's appropriate, also where it's not appropriate. And that gives us a starting point in terms of the possibilities. Same thing with building heights, the hot topic in Santa Barbara right now. And we have the existing building height limits map, which I think you'll be intrigued to look at and understand that, because that's the basis for then your commenting to say, well, what should we study in the future? And again, we're not looking to try and derive consensus here today. We're having more of a vigorous discussion about the possibilities, and it's over the next series of workshops that we hope to bring this into some kind of clear direction. So as John said, beyond today's workshop, we'll have additional workshops with you to talk about what comes out of today, and also the workshop we're doing today is being repeated on April the 23rd. So if you have friends or neighbors who couldn't make today, we have the same workshop, same location, 6 o'clock on April 23rd. So we certainly would encourage you to get the word out as well on that one. So with that, we want you to get into the groups. That's where we're going to have a lot of the action today. If you look on your name card, there is a number there indicating your group. And I'll just ask the facilitators there to raise their hands as we go through so you can identify who you're working with. How many people have a number 1 on their name tag? Okay. Number 1 goes downstairs. And who is the facilitator for group number 1? John. And he'll take you downstairs, but nobody leave yet, because that's where you're going to be. And then group 2, how many have a number 2? That's going to be right over here, off to your right. And then how many people, and who's the facilitator for number 2? Betty, excellent. Number 3 is going to be in the room through the exit door. How many 3s do we have? And then the facilitator for group 3 is going to be Liz, okay? So she'll take you into 3. And then how about the 4s? We have any 4s here? And who's the staff person? Okay, Heather, and she'll take you over into room 4. Now, anybody with a 5 or a 6? If you have a 5 or a 6, just remain in your seats, and I'm going to give you a number because we'll send you into one of those 4 groups. So based on that, we'll have about 4 groups working today. So we'd like you to join those groups, and we look forward to a good discussion where we like to hear your feedback today. Thank you very much. Acknowledge our facilitator team. They did a great job in helping us get through all of that. Let's give them a round of applause. Thank you very much. And want to also make sure you fill in and complete the comment card. You may still want to mull it over before the last session is over, so that would be appropriate if there's some other thoughts that come to mind as you're listening to these different group reports. But we do want you to turn them in before you leave, so make sure. You could send them in if you want. I want to make sure we get them. So we do have the session on Wednesday night here in the Faulkner Gallery, same place, 6 o'clock. So you're welcome to come again and see if there's any differences in what people say. But I'll also invite your friends and neighbors and colleagues to come because we're trying to get that many more people here. The more the better. And we'll also have all this material up on the website. People are asking about the slide presentation, and the results, of course, will be there. Last year's detailed results, in addition to the community input summary report, there's a lot more detail behind that. That is also on the web. So we'll put everything on the web, and we'll also summarize it because a lot of people want to get the high points, and particularly the Planning Commission, City Council will want to be able to access all of this material. So that being said, we'd like to give each group a few minutes. I know there's a lot to cover, so maybe just the most interesting points of agreement or disagreement and any other new ideas or insights that might have come from the group. Well, I know that's a challenge, and we're just not going to in any way call that the summary because we have the detailed comment cards. So I want to assure you that we'll be taking all of that into account. This is just so we can get a little bit of a flavor from each of the group and not to necessarily draw conclusions from necessarily. Okay, so the purpose of this feedback is just to get some sense of how each group addressed the various issues on our agenda this morning. So I believe we're going to start with group number 3, and Kathy and Shine are representing that group.
Okay, thank you. Well, group 3, we spent a lot of time talking at the beginning, so we got to about here, and then we went to straight voting. Our flip sheets, we have a bunch of stars on items we wanted added. I can't do it. Vertically challenged here. You'll see stars and things underlined. Those are things we wanted added to the study material. So we had a lot of those. On our discussions of the different items, as could be expected, the amount of growth and community land use priorities invoke the most discussion. And that's where we had a very diverse group, so we have very strong comments on both sides of the issue. Then building heights, there again, there's strong comments on both sides of the issue. It took people a while to realize we were talking about studying these items as opposed to what you liked or wanted. But I guess that leads to make sure they study what you like. So there our winner in terms of consensus and what everybody wanted is public open space. That got a 13, which is our highest score. Then came needs of special populations and affordable rental housing. Those are issues that haven't necessarily been given that much discussion, but these are things people really, really want. Then the most controversial, like I said, was the growth and land use priorities and the building heights. There were a couple of other items that are reflected here, like residential unit size. We went back and made comments on the areas that we just did voting. And then the housing mitigation fees, that got a split vote, as did second units. The yellows are indicative of areas that we felt further topics of study needed to be added that weren't in the choices we were given. Let's see. Where's our, the map. You want to do the map?
Yeah. Basically, we had, we're a very diverse group of people and evenly split on the building height issue. But in general, some of us said additional density in the east side area, explore the idea of mixed use in the industrial zone and the funk zone area. Careful about how to do how to redevelop the La Cumbre area. One person suggested we have buffers between the intense commercial activity on state and as it phases out into the residential, the single-family neighborhoods on either side of the on other side of state. Some suggested a two-story limit in the Mesa neighborhood near Cliff and Meigs, and the waterfront. Yeah. I mean, there are about half of us who said we should consider the 40-foot height limit, and the other half of us said, well, we should also look at the benefits of keeping it at 60 feet as part of the study. The question was phrased that, study limiting it, but we should also, I'm going to speak for the other half that say, well, we should also study for keeping it where it is. In Milpas, additional density, commercial density, I guess, along Milpas. Gutierrez is, could be built out a little bit more. Am I missing anything else from the group? Yeah, so it's, yeah.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. I like the duo presentation. Well done. How about group number 2? Can we shift over here? We have Steve from group number 2.
Okay. Just quickly then, the amount of growth, non-residential, most people in our group, we had 13 participants, felt that the planning team had nailed it in terms of range of study. Sorry? Oh, I'm sorry. In terms of, this is not matching my order here. In terms of the residential growth, I think that there was certainly an agreement amongst just the range of study, but also a feeling that we needed to look at other factors when determining what those optimal ranges might be. For example, relationship to alternative transportation. The community land use priorities, we had agreement in principle to the ideas that we need to give priority to these things. There was some concern about the addition of small local business and for-profit entities inside receiving those kind of incentives. The location of growth within our group, I would be fair to characterize it, if we want to look at the map, as typically observing the transit corridors within our community, including the Milpas corridor, including the Gutierrez, Haley corridors, State Street, and even on the Mesa Cliff Drive leading into the primary commercial area there. We did get a request for a reduction in density in the lower east side, given just some population relative to housing type down there. Open space and landscaping. We were split there, six, and with 2 in disagreement, 4 requesting modifications to the idea. And the thought was we had to make a distinction between providing open space on individual parcels vis-a-vis providing incentives for collecting via development impact fees or other ways the opportunity to create public parks that are more active rather than passive. On building heights, first time we went around and asked the question, we had 12 disagrees. People were disagreeing for different reasons. And when we came back and looked at the question again, we had a very, very sound discussion. But I think the fact that we had 12 people disagree was clearly evident that people understood just an arbitrary height limit across the board was an unsophisticated tool to begin to solve some of the problems we had. And we were universal regardless of which side of that fence we were on. Public open space, Betty, is my next one. Well, I think that came back to the discussion. I think there was general acceptance that in order to do this, the type of development on transit corridors, that we need to have available open space amenities. Complete agreement on development standards for a sustainable and healthy community. Agreement on the needs of special populations. 2 people were concerned that we need to be very careful about that and watch for the law of unintended consequences. Culture, arts, and historic resources, universally, the 13 of us agreed that we need to provide those incentives. And on residential unit sizes, a really interesting discussion. The way that the question is authored in the report, it suggested the unit size discussion was about reducing overall mass and scale. And our group felt that there were other tools and mechanisms within our kit of parts that deal with mass and scale. We should have a discussion about residential unit size, but it should be more about a socio-economic discussion. Who gets the housing? And the unit size should relate to providing housing for workforce and affordable. And another way to express it might be the reduction in unit sizes is not about making the box smaller, but about controlling what you're putting in the box to the benefit of our local community. I think they're the key points, Betty. Is there anything I missed, or did I distort that? Do you want to?
Yeah, I'll just, unfortunately, fortunately, we had really good discussion up to a point, and then, like most of you, I think, had to hurry along to touch all the other areas. So in transportation, we did talk about parking. Again, that question about changing parking standards to address congestion. The question was worded in a way that didn't help people talk about it, so we just talked about it for a while. And so we have various ideas about parking and traffic congestion. Then in housing, we mostly just took the tally. Unfortunately, the group did not get to discuss housing very much, except you can see that across the board, really interested in exploring rental housing programs. Again, we didn't talk about this, but it's interesting that 8 out of the 13 or 11 were interested in second units, but we never got to hear why or what would be involved in that. And then on the density standards, I think there's an interest in exploring that to promote affordable housing, which was the way the question was worded. And then employer-based housing, we added a question. There was a fair amount of interest in having programs and incentives for existing employers. The question was worded more about employers in development projects, and this group wanted to put on the table just encouraging existing employers to address housing needs too.
Thank you. Group 2. Let's go all the way over here to group number 1. Okay.
Hello, my name is Michael. And my group, we spent a lot of time at the beginning, just as many of you did as well, discussing the amount of growth. I think that with the different study points, there was a general consensus that they're all right study points, but that both for commercial and residential that we'd want to have more detail on the lower, like the study points 1 and 2 rather than 3 and 4. There is also a concern with the jobs housing imbalance, particular with the amount of commercial growth. So what kind of ratios are we looking at? And we wanted to emphasize that there's also many different types of growth. You can't look at just the number of units. You have to look at what type of units they are, how much people are going to be driving, who's going to be living in them. So those were some of the main things that came out of the growth part of it. We also, you can see, we pretty much agreed for the most part on where growth is happening in our city, that those are good places to put it. We wanted to highlight also that maybe some small areas in neighborhoods could be small commercial zoned, so that there's places that people can walk to, markets or restaurants, and that wasn't captured on the map. In terms of community character, I think in general there was a lot of agreement, but the most decisive issue was building heights. Some people agreed that building heights were a good thing. Other people felt strongly that a building height limit was kind of an unwieldy tool and wouldn't really accurately capture what we're trying to do. I think most people agree that there needs to be more discussion on that as well. Public open space, development standards, you can see most people were in agreement with the green there. Then getting on to transportation, that was the one place that everybody was in agreement that there needs to be more regional coordination in transportation, and also the parking policies to manage traffic. Let's see. With the talks about adequate alternative transportation, we wanted some more definition or agreement on what it is adequate to have that alternative transportation. There was some talks about car-free zones and also better bike lanes and more Class 1 bike lanes so that people can feel safe biking. And then with the housing, there was some disagreement with the housing. I think people, for the most part, agreed that employees should live close to where they work. We weren't really sure if, the employer should be mandated to do that, although a lot of people did agree. And let's see. There was some concern that these should be more market-driven processes rather than rules-driven processes. And let's see. Affordable rental housing, that was another win where everybody agreed that there needs to be more affordable housing in town, as well as mostly with the second grant of units as well. So I think that wraps it up for us.
Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you, Group 1. Then we just have our fourth and final group, if we could, hear from that reporter.
I was with Group 4, and I will start with the map first, and then I'll go to the flip chart. In the map, we talked about where we didn't want growth. Most of the people were like, we don't want it here, we don't want it here. And they were talking additional residential units. Mainly the high fire area was a major concern for people. None of the high fire was brought up around St. Francis Hospital. There's a lot of nice bungalow houses, and there are R2, so perhaps rezone this area to R1 to bring down the zoning so we don't have to worry about, we're trying to protect the bungalow homes that are there. There was a concern about having any additional housing that would impact the Level D intersections. And it was mentioned that there was a Level D intersection at Las Positas and Cliff, Las Positas and the 101 freeway, and Las Positas and Mission. And any additional housing that would cause impacts to these intersections would be detrimental to our community. Then it was mentioned that we're talking 20 years from now, and maybe the intersections won't be that impacted 20 years from now. But our discussion was, let's not impact the current intersections that are currently impacted. And Park. And then the last one person did suggest a place where housing could be, and that was at Las Positas in the 101 freeway, where there happens to be what appears to be some multifamily housing, even though it might be R1 by San Marcan and the 101 freeway. But then other people say that's not a good location because of the environmental issues of having housing so close to the 101 freeway. So that was the one location where it was suggested, and everywhere else it was like, it's not good here, it's not good here, and it's not good here, which is fine. Our major agreements, we all agree on having some kind of regional coordination for transportation to get from one end of the coast to the other end, or up and down our coast. It's very important. Open space and landscaping. I should go this way? On this side, okay. Open space and landscaping was very important, as well as public open space. When we start building more and more multifamily housing, you have people that really have smaller personal spaces, so then they go outside of their personal spaces to interact with the community, and those are very important. So as we build more units, the city also has to think about where the parks are going to be and annex land or somehow acquire more land to build more outdoor public space. Cultural arts and resources, we believe, yes, study that, provide incentives, because it is important for what our town is, what our city has to offer. Density was a major agreement to study density, and we'll leave it at that. Our disagreements, once again, was building height, what the height limitation should be. It should be studied. The parking policies we talked about briefly. Really, the parking policy is whether it's free and whether it costs and how long the free parking should last, because there is an impact to our downtown area with the parking and then how that parking affects the neighborhoods. And so there's a correlation between the two, and the parking should be studied. Housing mitigation fees. There was a concern if someone has to provide affordable housing units, that's one type of fee. If someone pays an in lieu fee, that's another type. But to require someone to pay both, is that what was written there? Is that what was being asked? So it needs to be studied. It's either or a combination, but it's good to study that. Secondary units, the granny units, it's an important thing to study. Even though it's a major disagreement, we agree it needs to be studied and looked at. There's concern for the protection of the neighborhoods where you have existing single-family homes and the impacts that these converted garages that are currently not being enforced, which is a sore spot with some people where they have problems with the impacts of additional cars on our neighborhoods. Then on the flip side, someone says, well, now if the state's mandating us to bring all these additional residential units into our community, well, goodness gracious, if we have an amnesty program that can legalize all these units that currently exist, we can make that number a lot smaller. So it should be studied and it should be evaluated. And key points, studying parking. So my group, was there anything else I should touch upon? If not, I'll pass the mic.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thank you. And once more, thanks to all of you for hanging in there. We did go a little extra time this afternoon, on a great weekend, and we appreciate your service to the City of Santa Barbara for doing so. I, again, want to remind you, April 23rd, Wednesday night, we'll be back here again, so stay tuned, and we'll keep you informed at each step of the way. We've got a big year coming up on the general plan, so stay with us. Thank you very much. Have a good rest of the weekend. Bye-bye. Daniel Isofano. I'm one of the urban planning consultants hired by the City of Santa Barbara to assist with these community planning workshops. We're really happy to see a good turnout here this evening. You may know that we had the same workshop on Saturday here in the Faulkner Gallery. Also a great success. We had a good turnout, and we had very vigorous discussion of the future growth and planning issues facing the City of Santa Barbara, and we hope to continue on with that here this evening. We really are looking at today's workshop as part of a series of meetings that started with the Planning Commission work session back on April 7th. And some of you may have tuned in to Channel 18 and seen the results of that work session. That was what we called development trends. It was a way to look at the history of recent times in the city of Santa Barbara, growth and development. What's occurred over the last 20 years and where are we today? Because as a foundation, we need to know that so we can plan the next 20 years. And essentially that's what we'd like to do this evening. So we had that session with the Planning Commission to help us frame the issues for discussion this evening. And you'll see that tonight we're also not trying to move anybody in a particular direction or come up with any particular conclusions just yet. It's really important for us to frame the nature of the discussion, identify the critical issues and some of the study points or items or options that you would like the staff to study in greater detail before you weigh in with a final decision or direction on what kind of future growth we should consider, where that growth might occur, and how it should be managed and shaped in accordance with your ideas about the future of Santa Barbara and the character of Santa Barbara. So I want to make sure everyone is understanding we're not going to try to move you to any conclusions this evening. That will occur, though, at some point later this year. We have other meetings planned, more workshops. We'll have sessions with the Planning Commission, with the City Council. So it's all part of a sequence leading up to that important set of decisions. So this evening, we're going to spend a little bit of time with a background presentation. If you did not get a chance to attend the Planning Commission workshop, or if you didn't get to see it on Channel 18, we're going to give you a very abbreviated version of the staff presentation that was made on April 7th. Essentially, it's a boiled down version of what's contained in this development trends report. And you may have been able to pick up a copy of this at the door. We're happy if you did, and we're not assuming that you've studied it in detail or read it even partially, so we're going to give you the high points of this report this evening. And then later on in the breakout groups, after this fairly short presentation, there'll be much greater opportunity to go into depth on these issues and make sure that everyone is understanding the nature of the questions that we're facing before we even begin to answer those questions. So that's how we'd like to proceed. Last time it took us the full 3 hours almost, 2.5 hours in the small groups to have the intense discussion that we needed to cover all the points, so we expect that'll be the case here this evening as well. So we hope you can stay with us all the way through till 9 o'clock, which is when we hope to bring it all to a conclusion. We may go a few minutes beyond that, but we have some refreshments there to help power us all the way through. But in any case, we'll be trying to wrap up around 9 or shortly thereafter. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce some of the main staff members who are involved in this whole planning effort. First, Betty Weiss, who is the city planner for the city of Santa Barbara, and she has been instrumental in putting this presentation together, running the team, helping to get this whole presentation and set of documents off the ground. Also, John Ledbetter, who is a principal planner and senior planner with the city, also will be speaking with you here this evening in just a moment. And John will take you through the essence of our development trends, highlights, and findings. And there are many other planning staff here which you'll meet in the course of tonight's discussion. They'll be working with you in the breakout groups. We think you'll enjoy those groups and find them very substantive, and we've also designed them to, in addition, to really calibrate the individual responses. So if you've been tracking this process, you know that we have a website called Plan Santa Barbara. All this information goes up on the web in summary fashion and also in detailed fashion, so that way you can see where the comments end up and always refer to those at any point later on in the course of this planning effort. So please welcome John Ledbetter to give us the opening presentation. John?
Great. Thank you, Daniel. Appreciate that introduction. And welcome, everybody. I'm really happy to see a lot of new faces that I haven't seen before, and that's really encouraging. We always like to see that. It's a good crowd tonight. Welcome. And as Daniel said, what I'd like to do is just touch on a few real key points that are going to be very germane to the exercise that we're going to be doing tonight that Daniel has helped us developed to try and encourage community discussion about what we feel are some of the key points, and try to define the range of issues that we're going to be studying further as we go along in this process. As many of you know, the two issues that are really driving this general plan update process are the renewal of our growth management program and sustainable Santa Barbara. How can we make Santa Barbara a more sustainable community? Measure E, which was adopted in 1989 at the time of our last general plan update, is the non-residential component of our growth management program. And really what that is a means to regulate the non-residential development over a 20-year period, which expires in 2010. And it limits the amount of non-residential growth to 3 million square feet over this 20-year period. The housing element calls for one of the policies in the housing element calls for us to go back and look at what the resources are and the conditions that are surrounding residential development when we hit 39,000 units. And today we're very close to that between what's built on the ground, and I'll get into some numbers in a moment, and what we have in the pipeline. And so between those two elements, they really comprise our growth management program today. And of course, the council has given us direction, and we've heard from the community, and it's really been an upwelling of interest in developing more sustainable policies to help guide our growth and development. And in fact, in 2005, the council adopted or reaffirmed a set of goals that were originally adopted in 1989 to guide that general plan process. But those goals have really rung true, and there was very minor wordsmithing and changes to those goals to reaffirm them to guide this process that we're in today. But one of the main ones, of course, was environmental policies and those related to sustainability. And I'll go over those in just a moment, too. We're now in phase 2, and we've recently completed phase 1 of the Plan Santa Barbara process last fall. And what the first phase entailed was establishing a baseline of information, and this was done in large part through our Conditions, Trends, and Issues report that looked at a lot of the resources that help to guide our development: water, housing, circulation, public services. And so that's been a very helpful document, as well as updating our master environmental assessment, and that looks at all of our thresholds. It's a series of different maps that looks at all the key environmental factors that help to make up a backdrop from which we review our projects on a daily basis. And then, of course, the public input. And again, MIG and Daniel have done a tremendous job of helping us with our outreach efforts during the first phase. And we used a real variety of means to get public input on some of the broader issues. And I know a lot of you have been involved in that, in looking at what are your concerns as a community, your appreciations, what you love about Santa Barbara, and what you hope for the future to see Santa Barbara evolve towards. And in this process, we not only held workshops last summer, which is a very typical thing to do in a process like this, but we also established a website, which is the first time we've done that for an outreach process, which has allowed us to maintain contact with emails and that kind of thing to notify people of meetings and also to take input that way. And then one of the more effective means that we've found was doing these what we call grassroots meetings, where we went out into the community, into different groups to present about what Plan Santa Barbara was and to hear from the groups. We went to over 40 groups and listened to everybody's concerns, and it was a very helpful process. Now, what was interesting when we came out with the community input summary report that summarized all this input in the first phase was the findings were very similar interestingly, to what the council goals had been established in 2005. And so between the public input and the council goals, they've really helped us to triangulate what direction we're going in now. And I don't expect you to be able to see this process, but this is a process chart that sort of outlines where we are. This is the phase 1 here. We're now in phase 2. And then phase 3 is the implementation phase here at decision-making. And if you look at where we are today, a little blow up here, as Daniel mentioned, the land use development land use development trends report was published in March here. Excuse me. Here, the work session of the Planning Commission was held last April the 7th, a couple of weeks ago, and here we are today at these workshops to get input on these development trends and what they mean. And I'll go into that in just a bit more here in a second. What we're going to produce after we hear from you as a community in the next step will be the policy options report. We'll have a report to the council, a check-in on that. And then we'll come back for another set of workshops in which we'll take this range of opinion that we've established from the input that we've received from the community and begin to fashion that into some policy options here. And, well, again, the community weigh in on which options seem right, and then we'll begin to develop a recommended policy preferences report, and then back up to the Planning Commission and to the City Council. So here we are at phase 2, and I think I covered most of this. Development Trends Report was in March, special PC meeting. And so one thing that's interesting was the tool that we used at the Planning Commission meeting was this discussion framework, and it was very useful in helping to look at the council goals, the community input summary report, the kernels, the most important pieces, the findings that came out of that, and then looked at the plans and programs the key plans and programs that are reflected in those goals and the issues that the community raised, looking at the implications of the last 20 years during the last planning period. And then finally, the consideration adjustments are really, those are the areas that need to be adjusted or tweaked in this next planning period as we go forward. And so that's really the focus of tonight's exercise, is to look at these considerations and adjustments and to see, hey, do these sound right? Is this the right range that we should study? Just touching again on the goals that the council helped to establish, living within our resources is a key one. That's been really our mantra, if you will, or really the guiding principle that has served us well over the last 17 years as we've grown and developed. Maintaining the unique character of our community, providing a wide range of transportation options to the automobile, ensuring affordable housing, making sure our neighborhoods are protected and the character is protected in particular, developing environmentally sustainable policies, ensuring that we have a strong economy, and providing adequate services and making sure that we're thinking regionally as well. So this is the tool that I was referring to that we presented on April 7th at the Planning Commission. And again, you know, across the top, you see these were the issues that there was this these were the issues that the goals and the community input had in common. And again, living within our resources, community character, et cetera, across the top, looking at the goals, the community input summary report, all the way down to the bottom there where you see the considerations and adjustments, which we're going to focus on tonight. And really, it's the precursor of the next set of policies. So tonight what we're focusing on are these four areas in particular, and we feel that these are the most important ones at this point, and we are able to integrate in issues of environmental sustainability, economic issues, public services, and regional issues within this, the framework for tonight's discussion. So before we begin, there's a few assumptions that we would like to just be very clear and explicit about that we feel are key to this whole process, and that is that there are environmental constraints such as water and energy that will be increasing as we head into the next 20 years. Driving is going to become more and more expensive. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that. Land costs will continue to increase. And we want to live within our resources. This is something, again, that we've heard over and over again. Thank you, Gary. And then just a couple more points on growth and development. It's important to understand and put into perspective the next increment of growth, and the next slide really shows and summarizes this well, and I'll go into that in a little bit of detail. But the amount of growth we're going to see over the next 20 years relative to what's really built on the ground is not that great, and it's important to keep that in mind as we go through this exercise. And then the other point is that when we start looking at developing a more sustainable Santa Barbara, it's going to require thinking beyond growth management. It's going to require changes to our lifestyles. And so we want people to start thinking about those and start making those connections and what that's going to mean. So here's the chart that I was referring to, and if you just bear with me for just a moment, I think it's really worth going through this. If you look at the top here, in 1989, that was the last time we updated the general plan, and at that point, we had about 35,700 residential units on the ground. In terms of non-residential development, and that's basically everything else besides housing, we had about close to 20 million square feet on the ground. And then during that planning period, the last 17 years, we've seen about 1,600 units built. And on the non-residential side, because we've had Measure E that's limited non-residential growth to this 3 million square feet over a 20-year period, we've seen about half of that developed over the last 17 years. So that's about 1.5 has been built. So if you look at that in terms of what you see today, we have about 400 units on the ground with about 1,600 units in the pipeline. So that puts us up to about 39,000 units, where the housing element says, hey, at 39,000, you need to start looking again at the resources that you have to support housing. And we have about 21 million square feet on the ground. So if you take those trends and you extrapolate those growth, particularly for residential over the next 20 years, it's about, we've been seeing about 100 units being built a year. So over the next 20 years, we're looking at about 2,000 units for a total of 39,500. Now, with non-residential, it's a little bit different because, again, we have Measure E in place, but if you were to just continue what we have left over, which is about 1.5 million, that would put us at about 23 million square feet total. Now, again, it's a little bit different for residential because we do have more capacity. It's not like we have a finite stopping point like we do under Measure E for non-residential. So there we have in the commercial zones approximately between 5,800 to 6,200 more capacity for more residential units in the commercial zones, and then a few more in the residential zones for a total of about 7,500. So over the next 20 years, we have the capacity to accommodate somewhere between 2,000 and 7,500 units. And that doesn't, and again, for Measure E, it's going to be somewhere between, well, either 1.5 or less. I mean, that's what we've heard over and over again. People don't want to see more commercial growth. If anything, they want to see less commercial growth. So those are the ranges that we're working with. This is what we refer to as the next increment of growth. And this is the first thing we're going to want you as a group to weigh in on. Is this seem like the right range of options and amount of growth, both residential and non-residential, that we should be analyzing as we go through environmental review, economic studies, et cetera. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel, and he's going to explain to you how the small discussion groups are going to work. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. Just to promise, again, we wanted to keep our presentation very brief so we can maximize time for the group discussions. And as John indicated, we really want you to focus on these questions, but not to answer the questions in any definitive way, because we think there's going to be a need for more analysis, more study. So I want to, again, emphasize that as you confront this very first issue, and it's probably one of the most important, uppermost in people's minds, and that is, well, what is the amount of new growth we should consider, and where should it be located? What should it look like? How should it be molded or configured in order to maximize the values you have here for quality environment, sustainability, and so forth. So those are all involved and very complicated questions that we won't be able to answer in any definitive way this evening. We're not expecting to, and we're not asking you to do that. Instead, we want to make sure that you help us frame the questions. As John indicated, there's a series of study points that indicate a different amount of growth for residential or non-residential development in the future. And we'd like you to comment on the range of study, not to necessarily pick one of those tonight, because you wouldn't have complete information on which to do so. We do expect to do that after some further analysis with the input you've given us tonight, and then coming back in another several set of workshops later this year, maybe June, July, or thereabouts. We haven't set the exact dates for that. So at that point, we'll be in a much better position to answer these questions. So we come to you this evening without any idea on our part as to what's the appropriate solution or answer. It really is up to you to help give us that direction. And that's how we'd like to proceed. Everyone should have a number on their name tag, which indicates the group that they belong to. All 6 of the groups are going to be doing exactly the same thing, so you don't need to worry about which group you're in. And let me just give you a sense of where those groups are located. First of all, if you have a number 1 on your name card, could I see the hands of people with number 1? Excellent. Okay, all of you would be out into the library and downstairs into the group 1 space, but nobody moved just yet. So if you have a number 1, you'll head downstairs. How many number 2s do we have? Number 2s. Okay, then you'll be meeting right about over here in this area. You can see the board with number 2 on it. Number 3s. How many number 3s? Then you will be through the exit door, and then to your left you'll see a sign there for group 3. And also group 4. Group 4. Also through the exit door, but turn right, and you'll see a sign for group 4. That'll get you in the right place. How many 5s do we have? Okay, group 5 will be meeting right over here in the same main room, but off to the corner there, just behind you. You can see the sign for number 5. And number 6, how many 6s do we have? Okay, the 6s will be downstairs, also through the lobby, down the stairs, through the woods, over to Grandma's. No, it's just across the way. It's not that far away, and staff will direct you accordingly. So we really appreciate you coming this evening. We got a great turnout, so bear with us as we make this transition to the small groups. We'll get organized and right into the discussion. So we look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you very much. And a couple of housekeeping notes as we wind down this evening. Number 1, please make sure you turn in the comment card. That's very important. We want to make sure we have all of your individual comments. Sorry, we need to try to get started here if we could. And that way we don't lose track of any individual person's response. So one of the ideas here of today's workshop was to make sure we don't try to generalize or summarize in a way that doesn't honor each individual's comments. And so we put a lot of effort into thinking how we can do this. And as we have done with the workshops from 2007, we will be putting all of the information onto the website, so you can be sure to have the opportunity to go look it up and refer to it and make sure that everything's been recorded properly, and you can also read everybody else's material as well. Before we get started with the group reports, I think we should acknowledge the city staff who set up tonight's workshop and the facilitators. They did a great job. Thank you very much. And so now, just to make sure we have some sense of how the different groups dealt with these topics, we wanted to give a couple minutes to each group. So again, I know this is a long day, a long evening, and a long workshop, but if we could just spend a few minutes on each group. So we asked them to give us some of the points where there was strong agreement, maybe some of the points where there was a lot of disagreement, so we can get a sense of how the groups converged or diverged, as the case may be, and also any other interesting ideas that might have surfaced that we can take away tonight. So it's not meant to be exhaustive. I do want to assure you the full report will involve looking at everybody's individual comment card, putting that together and summarizing it, so there'll be a full report of the workshop from Saturday as well as today. And stay tuned, because we'll have a lot more city council meetings as well as additional community workshops later on in the process for you to take this to the next step. So with that, let's have our spokesperson for group number 2. Do we have number 2 here ready to go?
My name is Mark Kirkhart. I was part of the group 2, and unfortunately I didn't take a lot of notes during the discussion, but I'll try to give you the highlights in as short a period of time as possible so we can keep moving. I don't know about the other groups, but it seems like we spent an inordinate amount of time on the living within our resources, future growth part. There was a lot of discussion probably on both sides. As you can see from the numbers here, we had, most people agreed that studying the points 1 through 4 from 1 million square feet of new commercial growth up to a maximum of 3 million. Though you can see, I think these people that were on the disagreement side here were more thinking that the 3 million square feet of additional commercial growth was probably much more than necessary. I think everyone probably has already heard that in the last nearly 20 years, 17, 18 years, of the 3 million square foot goal, 1.5 million new square feet have been built, but actually 500,000 square feet of 500,000 square feet have been demolished and not replaced. So we really only built about 1 million net new square feet in the last close to 20 years. So it seemed a little ridiculous to be studying going as far as 3 million square feet, although there was also some discussion about maybe even looking at something even less than the 1 million. So that was kind of the expansion on the non-residential. On residential, the 2,000 square foot or 2,000 unit threshold, which basically equals approximately what we built over the last 3 decades, 100 new units a year. Not very many new units, especially when you include all the, I guess this is, I'm giving you my opinion. That includes all the affordable units, by the way. In any case, I think the ranges were pretty much agreed to. I think we also threw out that maybe you could look at a study of doing potentially less units, even than the 2,000 units. We actually were in the discussion with the map regarding the land use, community land use priorities. There was discussions about, I think pretty much most people were into the idea of trying to approach it in kind of the village cluster ideas, trying to make a much more sustainable community of having, if you're going to increase housing, maybe have it where you can be walking distance to community markets, obviously close to transportation lines. I made the comment that I think preserving the open space and trying to get most of the development downtown was, I think, pretty much agreed to. There's a lot of talk about building within the resources and the kind of more sustainable approach. That was in this location, I guess, location of growth. Moving to community character, you can see we actually, by the time we got down here, we were all starting to agree, which is actually pretty good. The biggest disagreement and discussion probably was around this whole building design standards and height limits. I think everyone pretty much agreed with the open space. Some of the yellow votes here, I know, were maybe about having some gradation of whether that open space, when it's more certainly in a downtown, very urban environment on State Street, the kind of open space that would be required for commercial buildings would be different there than it might be as it moves out onto outer State Street, for example. The building heights, I think the limits were a pretty good limit. I at least suggested they may want to actually look at going higher, but that was really just to kind of spur the conversation.
Okay.
I guess I really shouldn't be commenting on what I said, should I? In any case, so then we got into pretty much agreement. I think that the staff has done a good job of outlining the goals of what the study should take into consideration. Moving over to transportation, regional coordination is, I think is paramount, absolutely. The parking policies, I think everyone was in our group was pretty much in agreement that it should be creative and kind of looking towards the future of what transportation is going to be like 25, 30 years from now. I think it's somewhat unfortunate that we're not looking further than just that length of time out. But I think being creative, and there was also some people that were very concerned about the adequacy of parking and having the way it's been for years, where parking spills out into the residential neighborhoods and people doing the 75-minute shuffle, moving cars around, that whatever we do needs to really address that. Over here in the housing area, pretty much agreement in the employer-provided housing. There was some discussions about the level of that. You know, if someone's coming in and building a large commercial building, might be one kind of requirement. I think the staff person, Betty, suggested, well, it might be almost like a school fees type of thing, where per square foot you would be paying into some kind of a pool, which I think was pretty much agreed to. New density standards. I'm trying to remember exactly what that one was, but I think most people, when we got down into here with affordable housing, there's a lot of discussion about the second units, and the issue about the reason that we haven't really done very many in the last years is because of the number of illegal units, that people are afraid that once they start trying to convert those, they're probably not able to convert them to make them legal. But I think in our group, we're pretty much interested in trying to find a way to get those legalized and really recognized, because many of them are actually better than some of the newer ones that have been built.
Okay.
So that's what we had.
Very good. Thank you very much, Group 2. Let's go over to group number 5. Do we have a spokesperson for Group 5? Okay.
I'm Mark Shields, along with
April Palencia.
And as a team, we looked at all the questions asked, and regarding living within our resources and future growth, in terms of the amount of growth, our team was on the same page in terms of, I guess, promoting non-residential in the downtown core, and also promoting residential, but we had some problems with the questions and how kind of ambiguous they were, so we were on the borderline in terms of just the wording of the question on that one. Community land use priorities, we were for that location of growth. We had some ideas on the map in terms of the core of the city, and the gist of our thinking was that we should really concentrate it downtown, as has been happening over the years, but also on Upper State Street, and also possibly trying to really strongly link State Street up as an urban core. So concentrating on commercial growth along the urban core, along with mixed use. Let's see. Community character, open space and landscaping. There was some discussion about that in terms of exactly what that meant in terms of commercial space and commercial buildings. One suggestion was that the commercial buildings, in terms of landscaping, the amount of landscaping was fine at this point in time, and that it is commercial, so it doesn't need to have a lot of landscaping. And the idea of having penthouse roof gardens came up as another way to look at enhancing the green space downtown without without having setbacks for commercial projects. Let's see. In terms of the height limits, our group basically disagreed with having to mandate height limits, and definitely not reducing the height limit to an arbitrary standard. There was some discussion about letting the design review boards manage that decision in terms of height, mass, bulk, and scale, because it's not always cut and dry, and how you do a building architecturally is really more the point than just how big it is. So I guess that was a point that we made. Providing exceptions, there was a lot of talk about, well, yes, in downtown Santa Barbara there are tall buildings and there are low buildings, and there's the Fox Arlington with a beautiful tower, and some of those conversations were about giving the opportunity for more interesting architecture by having not having the height limit mandated. In terms of public open space, in general, people thought that there was a good amount of public open space in Santa Barbara, and that we needed to take care of the space that we have. And a few people, what's that? Yeah, that it should be more drought tolerant, more sustainable. Also, the idea of converting maybe some of our less used parks into community gardens. So that was a nice thought. Promoting urban agriculture besides just landscaping. Let's see, where am I? Well, our group really agreed on providing a more sustainable future, and I think that was unanimous. In terms of what that is definitely, I think, small steps. The water system is important. Transportation, all of that is a big question, and I think we just wanted to make it viable to head in that direction somehow.
Okay.
Let's see, needs of culture, historical populations. We were for helping the needs of special populations, obviously, people who are handicapped or special needs. Providing public housing for police, people who help the community. We thought the question should better define what young people are and that sort of thing.
All right.
Let's see. Cultural. The group was in general for providing funding for cultural arts and historical resources, and there was an emphasis on providing some more funding for the arts. Santa Barbara tends to be, Santa Barbara says they're for the arts, but there's not like a viable way to raise money for the arts, so that was a point. Residential unit size, there were some conversations about what that means and the difference between developers needing to provide condominiums that are more high-end because they can make a profit selling those versus unit size being smaller so that developers can provide more rental housing. So there was kind of a discussion about what is a residential unit size. Regional coordination. Transportation, that was kind of a no-brainer. I think we all agreed that transportation needed to improve and that the corridor transportation needed to be strengthened. There was some discussion.
Okay.
What was that?
Okay. One more minute, if you could.
I was just going to say, in lieu of spending money on parking lots, we were thinking about putting that money into public transportation. That would be one place where the funding source could come from.
On housing, the employer-provided housing, we were ambivalent about that. We thought that question needed a lot more definition in terms of how big does the company need to be in order to qualify to provide employer housing. That seemed to be very arbitrary. New density standards, we were for coming up with new density standards to help developers provide low-income housing, and that being having the city look at different parking standards so that if you were doing a high-density project for low-income housing, that possibly the parking issue could be looked at more carefully to require less parking. Housing mitigation fees, either affordable rental housing, I think shouldn't be zoned. That was one of our main points, is that we thought one of the ideas was that there should be a zone in Santa Barbara for residential rental housing, but we thought that if you could spread that out throughout the city, you wouldn't have an area that's just solely devoted to rental housing. So that seemed like a more positive idea. And on second units, I think we all were in favor of getting the granny flats approved more easily and somehow lessening the requirements for them at the city and promoting that idea as a way to provide more low-income housing.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Group 5. Let's try group number 6, if we could. Do we have a spokesperson here? And you can take this one. Introduce yourself.
My name's Joe Underlitis, and I just want to take one moment of everyone's time. If you're under 40, would you please stand up? I want to thank you guys for showing up. These people standing up are the people we need to listen to about the future of Santa Barbara. So keep coming, guys. Okay. We had a great group. We were very civil and had some good conversations about these issues. Regarding growth, I think we were all okay with the parameters for the commercial growth. Under residential growth, we had comments about looking at less units and looking at more units than what you listed. And then we want to look at residential growth in the context of state mandates, infrastructure issues, water use, water retention, traffic, and all that stuff. Community land priorities and location of growth. We identified on the growth part, looking at developing more neighborhood commercial nodes throughout our community. And we circled a couple areas, and I can identify them for you guys. This area at Foothill and the 154, On Terre and Foothill, Alomar and Foothill, emphasizing more commercial growth and retail growth here at the St. Francis Hospital site, the Mission Corridor, the end of where Oak Park meets the freeway, Las Positas and Modoc, Mesa Center, the area next to City College. Really looking at those areas and finding ways to zone them possibly to promote neighborhood mom and pop shops that we can all walk to and bike to and have access to. So that was good. Open space and landscaping. We talked about the location of open space and relative to where the commercial building lies in the central business district and how that may want to vary based on that location. And a lot of talk about form-based coding and looking at flexible ways to allow that open space to occur. The height issue, we all agreed that we don't believe in ballot box planning, that the whole height discussion needs to be roped into the general plan. We believe the height discussion should occur, or we should talk about it, but it should be in the scope of all this general plan discussion. Regarding the height issue, there was more talk about the form-based coding relative to height and how its relevance to the existing zoning rules. Regarding, let's see, what's the next one? Residential unit size was a big topic. We did talk a lot about how the variable density formula currently works, and I think it works against what we want because it's based on bedroom count. So there's a lot of discussion on limiting unit size and basing it strictly on unit size and not bedroom count. And you need to look at that and its relationship to parking and the parking demands that we impose on mixed use and residential multifamily projects. Going back to living within our resources, we wanted to analyze that in context with how we use our resources and to really study our ecological footprint. There was discussion about what's the carrying capacity of our current resources. So based on how we use those resources, can we support a larger population? What is the projected population growth for Santa Barbara over the next 20 years? And how can we implement incentives to live a little differently to preserve those resources? Employer-provided housing, there were exceptions to that. We didn't think requiring large employers to employ housing was going to be beneficial to the economic vitality of the city. We might drive big business out of Santa Barbara if we do that. So we thought it was better to provide incentives for employee housing. Parking policies, I think what people had an issue with is that it talks about having alternative transportation available, but it really isn't available. So if we want to look at limiting parking, we have to look at how to make alternative transportation more available to the public. And we think, at least I considered that we should look at the retail component of limiting parking as well. There was talk about housing mitigation fees weren't specific enough, and there was discussion about real estate transfer tax to provide fees for affordable housing. And we all agreed on development standards for sustainable and healthy communities, but we wanted to include walkability, living close to home, and there was a lot of talk about rental housing. We had a young person in our group that wanted to look at rental housing options and making that more affordable for her. So I hope I covered it all.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Okay, let's have group number 3, please. Group 3 up here. Oh, Liz, okay.
I was the facilitator. I'm a city staff person. Rule number 1, you should not be the person to report back out, but the group overruled me. And the group kind of had their way with the questions, too. So although I have to admit there's a lot of similar comments coming out from the other groups, I won't go into it all. And you'd have to come up and get a closer look at, again, like other people, we spent a lot of time on the first page on the future growth limits. And in the end, we ended up voting on the 4 different study points individually. And on the study point 1, 10 of our 17 people felt that it was too restrictive and they couldn't support it. But 7 people thought it should be looked at. And then more people were in support of the middle study point ranges. And then they created a 5th category that did not have a numerical cap. In fact, someone called it a capless ratio. And we all heard, we thought she said a capitalist ratio. And we're like, so anyway, so they did a study point 5 that would not have a numerical cap, but would be based on resources and a jobs housing balance. And that got the support of a majority of the group. On the residential cap, there was more agreement, and most people felt that the 2 study points were, they could agree with that. 5 thought that there should be a middle point between the 2 study points, and 1 person felt that there should be less residential growth. Then again, just to hit some highlights, and I'm sorry, group, if I'm not hitting it all, on the increasing building heights was another area where they didn't feel the questions were got them to what they wanted to say. And so, although we voted on the questions as they were worded, lowering the height limits in buffer zones, there was some mostly agreement for that. Blanketly lowering it to 40 feet, most people disagreed. 4 were in support and 4 weren't. But then they created a new one to increase building heights, and 6 people were in support of that and 8 people weren't. But again, they kind of had to bust the envelope there. On development standards, we had a lot of support on a lot of the other ones. Again, on residential unit size, they hated the way the question was phrased. Didn't even want to vote on it, except I forced them to, and because we gave them another one, which was to create incentives for smaller units, and that's really what they wanted to see, and they all had agreement on that. But they really didn't like the way it was worded. They didn't feel it was related to the size of the building. It should be more towards affordability. And let's see, regional coordination and transportation policies, pretty much consistent with what other people have said. On housing, the group really didn't like the employer-provided housing as questions. 5 could sort of support, but 11 disagreed, and other people have said that they think it's hard enough to be an employer in the city of Santa Barbara to add on another onus just wouldn't be right. But they really wanted to look at incentives for employers to provide housing for their employees. So again, they added a question, and just about everybody agreed that the city should encourage employers for incentives. That, I think, was a common theme throughout. They really wanted to do more carrots and less sticks. Okay. Housing mitigation fees, didn't like that. They rewrote the density standards as well. They wanted to vote on increasing density standards for affordable housing, and the majority supported that. But then they also thought the question was trying to get at our inclusionary housing program and whether the percentage of affordable units in that should be increased. And there was kind of split, but support with some, I can't remember what the yellow votes were about, I'm sorry, our group. And everything else they supported, second units almost unanimously with just one person as a yellow vote. And on the map, it's what other people have been talking about, neighborhood small markets in our existing residential zones and focusing our residential in the downtown, and some discussion about the Mesa having good transit and that there could be more density out there.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Group 3, they definitely win the Creative Group Award for this evening. Let's try group number 1 here. Do we have a reporter for group 1? Okay. Who's on? Group 1. Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Marsh. I want to thank everyone for coming out and participating. My group is Group 1, and certainly had a very dynamic group, different ages, and a lot of discussion, and a lot of good points. For the first category, the non-residential, there's a lot of agreement on the first two, the 2,000, I believe it was, I don't have my paper with me, the first 2 categories of the 4. 3 and 4 were not agreed upon as well. Most people did not really want to look at that, as it turned out. And as for the residential, does anyone have one of the papers? I don't remember the questions. Thank you. All right, much better. For the study point, a lot of people were in the middle ground between the 2,000 units and the 7,500 units. A number was floated at 4,500, and nobody's really okay with 7,500 units in just developing that kind of mass amount over the next 20 years and increasing the urban sprawl. We're very much against that as a group, as I recall. For the community land use priorities, we were very much in favor of the open space and landscaping, though there were some reservations about forcing the open space and losing your ability to create housing because you're now using open space instead of and losing some of your ability to modify your architecture to accommodate these people, as some people have mentioned. I'm sorry if I leave things out, but let's see. So yeah, we had a lot of agreement there, though, and we didn't have a whole lot of agreement on a lot of things. So, for instance, this next question: building design standards, lower limits in buffer zones. Let's see, which question is that? B1. I don't really remember too much. Oh no, that's the building height one. All right. Definitely had some comments about the building heights. Some people were for lowering them. But quite a few people were also for keeping it the same, and there's a lot of talk about exceptions. What would be an exception? Most people would be, yes, I'll make a hospital as an exception, but I don't think other things should be exceptions. There was a lot of talk and a lot of conversation about, again, the vagueness of the rules. Vagueness of the questions was definitely a concern for people. Again, our group probably would have liked to rewrite everything like the other group did, but we didn't quite take it that far, for better or worse. All right, the covered providing exceptions. Again, 9 to 6, 9 agree, 6 disagree, so there was definitely a lot of conversation about that. Public open space, very much agreed, 14 to 2. So, again, a lot of the same concerns some of the other speakers had. Development standards for a sustainable and healthy community, that is D. Everybody was pretty much for this. I can't imagine anybody not wanting to address solar energy, rainwater, urban gardens, and becoming more sustainable as a society, because if we don't, there's not going to be a society left. So we need to make change now, or there won't be any time for change. There's definitely a lot of agreement with that. Needs of special populations, that's a no-brainer. Everyone agreed. We have to address issues with this. Help people out, that's what being a human is all about. Helping your fellow man or woman. Community characteristic, continued culture, arts, and historical resources. Again, a lot of discussion on the art. One group member felt that in light of the changing climate, that unfortunately art and historical resources are no longer a top priority, and thus funding maybe should be allocated to other things, although we'd certainly love to have culture, arts, and historical resources obviously promoted in such a beautiful place in Santa Barbara. But again, a lot of agreement that there should be incentives and programs. Residential unit size. Again, a lot of conversation here. We see 7:5 to 2 ratio. Again, the clarity of the question, I don't think people were too happy about that. I don't remember what the yellows were against this. I know I personally had wrote that I believe in limiting the size of some of the single housing, because what do you need a 10,000 square foot house for when you're using a lot more energy to heat it and run the house and all these things that somebody in a smaller house would be living a little more sustainably. Kind of ties into ecological footprint. I'm sure my professor's smiling on that one. Regional coordination. A lot of people were definitely in favor of this. In fact, this is probably the one we agreed on the most, 12 to 1. Definitely coordinate with transportation choices as to eliminate the traffic downtown, especially on Upper State Street, as a lot of the group members said. That was definitely a problem. Parking policies. Limit the employee parking. That was definitely a point of contention. Both pros and cons of such an arrangement. And a lot of, again, we want to see incentives, not standards and punishments. Incentives to do things. Funding the transportation choice, I think we were very much in favor of that. Employer-provided housing, again, the same points the other group raised. Density standards, we were very much in favor of changing the density standards. The housing mitigation fees, that one we had a little more talk about it, exactly how it was going to get done. Again, question wording. Affordable renting housing. I think a lot of us agreed with it, but again, the wording and exactly how it was going to be done was a concern for the group. And second units, we were very much in favor of making it easier to get second units.
Okay, very good. Thank you much. Cool. Okay, group number 4 is our final group for this evening. If we could zip through that, thank you.
I have to back clean up 2 days in a row. Anyway, I'd like to one-up Joe Andrulaitis and say, how many people are here that are under the age of 14? Stand up. Stand up. Come on. 2 people from our group. And the guy back there in another group. This is the future we're designing for. We're already old, Joe. I'm sorry, over 40. We're has-beens. We got to be planning for the future generations and their kids is what we got to keep in mind. I think our group really felt that a sustainable future was important, and the environmental impacts of all of these decisions are really what we're looking for staff to provide for us so that we can make really good decisions about the future of our city. And all the studies need to be done in the context of the water, the traffic, the air pollution, all those sorts of things. And even when we talk about who is our city, we should maybe even include the people that commute here, the 10,000 people that commute here daily, and include them in our footprint and figure out how we can provide housing for them and get them off the roads or give them mass transit. Just stop the commuting in cars to get here. Put some of them on mass transit, provide some affordable housing for them somehow, and get them to work. Unlike everyone else, I'm just going to talk about the things that we agreed about the things we didn't agree about, and what we came up with on the map. So I'll start with the things we didn't agree about, but had a great discussion about with a really awesome group, very diverse age-wise. The M1 zone, it's a big purple area down here. We talked a lot about whether is that the perfect place to put stuff, or is that the place that needs to be preserved so we can have some industrial in town. And that's one of the issues we had a long discussion about, and we were still split on in the end. So I think that area warrants some special consideration. Housing is not allowed there currently, and part of it has to be coastal serving. So it's kind of an anomaly area with a lot of potential. It's right on our waterfront. Another one was density and height, of course, all over the place on that. Didn't have any consensus, but had a lively discussion. And when we were talking about height, one of the 14-year-olds said, well, if we reduce the height to 40 feet, doesn't that mean we have to have more projects? And everyone went, shh, wow, you got it. You know, it's impressive. Parking incentives, reductions, a lot of discussion about that. Maybe there's a solution there, but the details need to get studied. We didn't have consensus on whether it was good, whether it was bad, but one of the areas we had a more lively discussion. A lot of areas we agreed upon. Supporting granny units was almost unanimous in single-family zones, although we said that maybe the size of those granny units needs to depend on the size of the lot. If somebody has a half-acre lot, somebody said maybe they should be allowed to have a larger granny unit. If it's a constricted 7,000 square foot lot, maybe they'd be limited to 600 square feet or 500 square feet or something like that to keep it appropriate to the neighborhood. But we did feel that someone had an ingenious idea. If we can legalize the existing granny units, maybe we can meet the state mandates for units without building additional mass housing in some areas of our town and pick up legitimizing what we're already using, actually. So I thought that was a pretty good idea. Development standards for sustainability and a healthy community, of course, everybody voted for that. One thing we did talk a lot about was a linked transportation system and how that can form the shape of our city. So I'm going to just jump right to the map and talking about all of the modes of transportation: a plane, a train, a bus, a car, a taxi, a bike, walking on feet. How does that relate? Right now, our city's laid out linearly so that when you drive down a main street, you can stop your car anywhere, get out, shop, get back in your car, drive a little farther down the street, stop, get out. But if you think about a transportation node model of city planning, you can only get off the bus at the bus stop. So you should have the stuff at the bus stops or at the transit nodes. That's where you want to put your density. That's where you want to put your commercial growth. So we drew circles on the map to represent a pearl necklace, if you will, or something, puka shell, whatever you want to call it, like nodes that would get developed where the density could happen that could also maybe connect up with the transit model. What that does is also might change the varying height. Like if you think of this is my analogy, I'll admit, a piece of music and everyone turns the volume up to 10, it's going to sound horrible. And I think that's what we have along this corridor. And the models that we're looking at is what happens if all the buildings are, maximum height, 60 feet. It'll be horrible. But if you listen to a song, there are some parts that have loud volume. There's parts that have a soft volume. You can't have the tubas and the flutes and everything going max volume all the time. But if you make them appropriate, a nice sax solo is good to hear every once in a while. And we need to use form-based zoning to make that happen in our city if we want to keep it beautiful. And there was a fear that if we lowered the height, again, I'm getting into things we didn't agree about, it all maybe get closer to all being the same height and maybe a little less interesting. And I think the quality of life, of course, is what everyone likes about the city so much. Another idea was to spread the new housing around town to promote diversity in our neighborhoods, economically, age-wise, as opposed to just saying, oh, the east side's a perfect place for a lot of dense housing. It is, but so is the west side, so is Upper State Street, so should be downtown. And if we sprinkle that around, we can build diversity into our neighborhoods as opposed to block zoning things, had been done in the past. Let's see here, hold on. Yep. Little oddball nodes that we hadn't really thought about. The west side over here looked like a great one. Is getting started over there, and maybe that could be improved. The Milpas corridor, of course, new development opportunities. Another great concept, study people, carrying capacity, not unit numbers. I mean, all of the reports in the book there are about how many units we could build, but it doesn't talk about how many people we can get off the road. And if we're dealing with people driving up in single cars from Ventura, we need to figure out how to get those cars reduced, how to get those people out of the cars, and how to get those people into houses where they can live with their families. Not such a large minimum size for studio apartments. We were talking about some kind of a 1,600 square foot restriction or limit for the minimum size for a studio, and maybe there's opportunities to make smaller units and we can get more of them in with a smaller footprint. Study variable density to lot size requirements. Importance of open space, of course, universally approved, and how to obtain it for additional parks for the city. We also felt that the city should press this whole little area down here in the coastal zone that's required to be used only for tourists and visitors, to see if there's any way we can press the Coastal Commission to have local uses like high-density housing, perhaps, down there, mixed-use projects down along the waterfront, as opposed to just having everything have to be visitor serving. And then, of course, my favorite was to study the two-car garage requirement for single-family residences, and to see if there's a way that we can get around having a two-car garage required for every house, maybe tandem garage option being available, so that our existing housing infrastructure doesn't need to be torn down to accommodate a second car and a small master bedroom addition. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Group 4. And really great work tonight, and let's give all the reporters a round of applause because I think they did a fabulous job. And again, on behalf of the city staff and the city council, who've really been instrumental in putting this whole effort forward, their leadership, the planning commission as well has put a lot of energy. We want to thank you for coming out tonight. Don't forget to turn in your comment card. It's very important for us to have this individual record of your thoughts, and stay tuned for the next events. We'll let you know coming up later this year, June or July, additional workshops on Plan Santa Barbara. Have a great evening. Thank you.